Garrick Voss grabbed his youngest daughter's wrist the second she turned to leave, and the grip was not a father's grip. It was a landlord reminding a tenant of what they owed. "Stand still," he said through his teeth, smiling at the same time, because there were cameras, because there were judges and city councilmen, and 3 generations of inherited money watching from every corner of the ballroom. "You will stand still, and you will smile, and you will not embarrass this family tonight." Elowen looked at her wrist. Then she looked at his face. And she smiled. God help her, she smiled, because 27 years of practice had made it automatic. If you've ever smiled through something that was breaking you apart inside, you already know exactly who Elowen Voss is. This is the night everything changed. And it started the moment those ballroom doors flew open and a man walked in who didn't smile at anyone. Before we go any further, if stories about survival, betrayal, and women who refuse to stay buried speak to you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every single week, we bring you stories that will stay with you long after they're over. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that ballroom, because you need to see what happened next. The Alderwin Hotel had been standing in the heart of Chicago for 90 years, and in that time it had hosted governors, gangsters, debutante balls, and one very quiet funeral reception for a man nobody publicly admitted to knowing. Its grand ballroom could seat 400 and still feel intimate if you knew how to arrange the lighting. And whoever Garrick Voss had hired to manage this evening knew exactly how to arrange the lighting. Crystal chandeliers threw their glow across 12 tables, draped in ivory linen. The flowers were real white peonies and dark greenery flown in from somewhere that charged by the stem. A string quartet played in the far corner, classical arrangements of songs that had originally been pop ballads, dressed up until they were unrecognizable, which Elowen thought was appropriate for the occasion. Her sister Maribel stood at the center of all of it, in a dress that cost more than Elowen's annual salary, laughing at something her new husband had just said in the particular way. Maribel laughed when she wanted people to see her laughing. Preston Aldgate. The third Elowen had started thinking of him in full formal title because it was the only version of the name that captured how aggressively he embodied it, stood beside his new bride with one hand at the small of her back. Proprietary and practiced, a man who had always understood that wealth and position were performances requiring rehearsal. It was a beautiful wedding. Elowen hated it precisely because of how beautiful it was. She was standing near the bar with a glass of wine she hadn't touched when her father found her. Garrick Voss was 61 years old and built like a man who had once been physically formidable and had since redistributed that mass into something heavier and more settled. His hair was silver. His suit was charcoal and bespoke. He wore a watch that Elowen knew cost more than her apartment because he had told her what it cost. Once, not as a boast, but as a clarification of distance. Here is what this family is, and here is where you currently fall within it. You're lurking, he said, not looking at her, studying the room the way he always studied rooms, calculating social geometry, measuring who was talking to whom, who had arrived, with whom, who had left early, and what that departure communicated. I'm standing at the bar, Elowen said. Same thing. He reached past her and accepted a glass of champagne from the bartender with the ease of a man who had never once in his life waited for anything. Maribel has been asking where you are. Elowen doubted that sincerely, but said nothing. I need you to circulate, Garrick said. Talk to the Hendersons. Aldgate's father has been watching us all evening, and I want him to see that this family presents itself correctly. Elowen turned her glass slowly in her fingers. I am presenting myself correctly. You are hiding near the ice bucket, making the family look fragmented. He still wasn't looking at her. That was the thing about conversations with Garrick Voss. You rarely had his actual attention. You had the portion of his processing power he allocated to managing you, which was distinct and considerably smaller than his actual attention. Put the wine down. Get something with bubbles. Go stand near your sister. Elowen put the wine down. She did not get something with bubbles. She walked toward the far side of the ballroom, near the windows, where the lighting was slightly dimmer and the view of Lake Michigan was visible through the glass. The November water, black and restless beneath a sky that had been threatening weather since morning. She didn't particularly want to look at the lake. She just wanted 60 seconds in which nobody was directing her movements. She'd been working at the Chicago Municipal Archives for 4 years. The job involved records management, digital cataloging, permit cross-referencing, document authentication, the invisible infrastructure that kept the city's institutional memory intact. Her father thought it was a clerical job. Her colleagues knew better, because the colleagues who'd actually tried to replicate what Elowen did when she was out sick had discovered that what looked like routine filing was in fact a sophisticated interpretive practice built on an almost compulsive ability to see connections between documents that other people processed as separate and unrelated. Elowen could look at a shipping permit from 1987, a zoning variance from 2003, and a property transfer from last month, and understand the story they were telling together. It wasn't a skill anyone had taught her. It was a skill she'd developed because growing up in the Voss household had required learning to read what was not being said, to trace what was missing, to understand that the surface presentation of a thing was almost never the complete truth of it. Her father had spent 27 years teaching her that lesson, without knowing he was teaching her anything at all. The string quartet shifted into something slower, and the dance floor filled with couples moving in careful, elegant orbits around each other. Maribel pulled Preston out to dance, and the room turned to watch them the way rooms turned to watch beautiful people do beautiful things. That collective soft focus of admiration that Maribel had always attracted and accepted as simply her due. Elowen watched her sister and felt something that wasn't quite envy and wasn't quite grief. Somewhere between the two, maybe. A sadness that had been living in her chest, so long it had grown comfortable there. She was still standing at the window when the doors opened. Not the polite click and swing of a late-arriving guest. Not the controlled entrance of catering staff. The ballroom doors came open, the way something comes open when the people opening them have decided in advance that no obstacle is going to stop them. And the sound of it, that particular percussion of authority, cut through the music and the converse. Every person in the room hit momentum at the base of the skull simultaneously. Quartet stopped. One of the violinists actually lowered her bow. 5 men walked in first. They wore dark suits and moved with the specific physical economy of people who spent time thinking about how to move through spaces without being stopped. Behind them, walking at a pace that communicated he was not following anyone, that the 5 men in front of him were punctuation. Not escort, came a man that Elowen did not recognize. She would learn his name in the next 4 minutes. Cassian Rourke was 39 years old, and the most immediate thing about him was not his height, though he was tall, and not the quality of his clothes, though they were clearly expensive, and not the controlled stillness with which he carried himself through a room full of terrified people. The most immediate thing about him was his eyes. Dark, absolutely focused, and already moving across the room in the deliberate way of someone who has arrived with a specific purpose and is locating the object of that purpose with methodical precision. Garrick Voss intercepted him before he made it 10 steps past the entrance. Elowen couldn't hear what her father was saying from across the ballroom, but she could read the body language, and what she read was a man performing desperation while trying desperately to conceal that he was performing desperation. Garrick's hands were moving. He was a man who spoke with his hands only when something had gone badly wrong. He was gesturing toward the windows, probably toward the view, the city, something intended to suggest abundance, availability, a willingness to negotiate. He reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced something, a folded document, maybe, or an envelope. Cassian Rourke did not look at whatever Garrick was offering. His gaze had already moved past Garrick's shoulder, and it had found Elowen at the window, and it had stopped. She felt it before she fully processed it, that specific sensation of being in someone's direct lines of sight, the way the air changes slightly, the way your own attention sharpens in involuntary response. She had been invisible for most of this evening, for most of her life in rooms like this one, and the sudden weight of being seen so completely and so deliberately by someone she had never encountered was deeply disorienting. Cassian said something to Garrick without looking at him. Whatever he said made Garrick's hands drop. Then Cassian started walking toward her. The guests parted. They didn't do it dramatically. It wasn't a movie. People didn't throw themselves aside, but they stepped back. The way people step back from something whose trajectory they've recognized and decided not to contest. Elowen watched him cross the room toward her and understood with absolute clarity that running was not an option she actually had, and that even if it were, some stubborn and possibly self-destructive part of her was not going to take it. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could see the gray at his temples, earlier than you'd expect for his age, and the faint evidence of an old scar at the corner of his jaw, and the fact that his eyes were not simply dark, but very specifically brown, kind of brown that caught light and refused to give it back. He looked at her for a long moment, not the way her father looked at her, with the calculating assessment of a man measuring utility, and not the way most men at events like this looked at her, which was to say not much at all. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they've been looking for. Mine, he said. One word. Quiet enough that only she heard it, but the quality of silence in the ballroom had become absolute enough that it seemed to carry regardless. The room did not move. Elowen's first coherent thought, underneath the shock and the anger and the sudden cold electricity of standing this close to genuine danger, was that she had spent her entire adult life studying documents that told the truth about people who lied, and she knew the way she knew when a shipping manifest didn't match its corresponding invoice that this man was not performing. He was not making a social gesture or a power display for the benefit of the assembled guests. He had come here for her, specifically, and her father had known he was coming. That last realization arrived 3 seconds after the first, and it hit harder. She turned toward Garrick. He was still standing near the entrance, and when their eyes met across the ballroom, she saw the thing she'd been hoping she wouldn't see. It was not horror. It was not paternal fury. It was relief, the involuntary and unmistakable exhalation of a man whose problem has just been resolved, and the sight of it carved something out of her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "What did you do?" she said, not loud. Not a question, really. Garrick crossed the room toward her, and up close his composure had fractured at the edges in ways a stranger might not have caught. But Elowen had been reading her father's face her entire life. His jaw was set too tight. The vein at his left temple was visible. He was afraid, and underneath the fear was the arithmetic of a man who had already completed the calculation and arrived at an answer that cost him very little personally. Elowen. His voice was low and even, the boardroom voice, the voice he used when he needed to move something from column A to column B and didn't want the room noticing the transaction. "This is not the moment. Tell me what you did. This is a business matter that you don't have the context to. Tell me what you did to me." Something shifted in his eyes. Not guilt. Garrick Voss had not experienced guilt in any recognizable form for a very long time, but something like the acknowledgement that the performance was no longer working on this particular audience. "Cassian Rourke is a man with whom I have a financial disagreement that needs resolution. You being here tonight in this company gives us time to. I'm the resolution." She said it flatly because she had already understood it, the way you understand the answer to a math problem, before you've technically finished working it out, when the shape of the numbers makes the outcome inevitable. "You offered me." Garrick said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Elowen turned toward Maribel. Her sister was still on the dance floor, though she'd stopped moving when the music stopped, and she was watching from 20 feet away, with Preston's hand still at her back and an expression on her face that was. And Elowen would spend a long time processing this later, in quiet, at the window of a room she hadn't expected to be, in an expression of helplessness that was also, underneath it, acceptance. Maribel knew. Not all of it, maybe, but enough. Enough to understand what her father had arranged, and she had arranged her own understanding of it in the way that people arrange terrible things when the alternative is confronting them directly. She did not move. She did not speak. She held her husband's hand, and she looked at her sister with sorry eyes, and she stayed exactly where she was. The sorry eyes were the worst part, because sorry eyes meant Maribel understood it was wrong and had decided, somewhere in the quiet of her own conscience, that the cost of intervening was higher than the cost of watching. Elowen looked at her father. She looked at her sister. She looked at the 400 guests who had been celebrating in this ballroom 20 minutes ago and were now standing in the particular stunned silence of people watching something happen that they will describe very carefully for years in terms, that avoid ever placing themselves inside the story. Nobody moved. Nobody chose her. She had known that this was possible, had known, if she was being honest with herself in the way she was rarely permitted to be honest with herself in this family, that she occupied a position in the Voss hierarchy that was contingent and transactional, but knowing a thing intellectually and experiencing the physical confirmation of it were completely different kinds of knowing. Elowen picked up her clutch from the window ledge where she'd set it. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand. She looked at Cassian Rourke, who had been watching all of this without expression, and said, quietly and precisely, "I'm walking out of this room under my own power." Something moved in his eyes, infinitesimal. She caught it anyway. He stepped aside. She walked through the ballroom toward the doors, and the guests parted again, and nobody said anything to her. A sound line wood splitting, and she did not look at her father or her sister or any of the 400 people who had been eating catered salmon and complimenting each other's watches while her life was being arranged without her knowledge. And she walked out through the entrance and into the hotel corridor, where Cassian's men fell into formation around her, as if they'd been expecting this and had decided it was satisfactory. The corridor smelled of carpet cleaner and old money. Behind her, she heard the ballroom doors swing shut. The string quartet did not resume. Outside, 2 armored black vehicles sat at the hotel entrance with their engines running. The November air was brutal, that specific Chicago cold that didn't just lower your temperature, but seemed to compress you, to press in from all sides. Elowen stood on the steps while one of the men opened a vehicle door, and she was very careful to keep her face neutral, because she had learned a long time ago that showing fear to men who already held power over you was simply handing them additional power, and she had nothing left to give away tonight. She got in the vehicle. The door closed. Cassian got in on the other side. The convoy pulled into traffic, and the lights of Chicago moved past the tinted windows in long amber and white streaks, the city doing its city thing. Indifferent and enormous, and full of a million other people, having a million other evenings that had nothing to do with any of this. After 3 blocks of silence, Elowen spoke. "Why me?" It was not a question exactly. It was the first line of a conversation she intended to conduct on her own terms, regardless of the circumstances. Because she had been silent in that ballroom long enough, had been silent in that family long enough, and silence had demonstrably not protected her from anything. Cassian looked at her across the dim interior of the vehicle. He had the manner of a man who was accustomed to being the one who decided when conversation started and stopped, and who had just encountered something that disrupted that accustomed position. "Your father stole from me," he said. "I gathered." She kept her gaze level. "That doesn't answer my question." "It does. Partially." "Then answer it completely." The vehicle hit a stoplight. The red glow came through the windows and painted the interior briefly. And in that light, Cassian Rourke looked at Elowen Voss with something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that lived in the space between assessment and recognition. "Garrick Voss has spent years disposing of things whose value he never understood," Cassian said. "I have a professional interest in correctly identifying value." "That's not an answer. That's a business philosophy." "Yes." "Why me specifically?" "There was a wedding. There were 400 people in that room. My father could have offered you money, property, company shares. He offered all of those things, and you walked past all of it." "Yes." "Why?" Cassian looked out the window. The light changed. The city slid past. "Because your father has been making the same mistake for 27 years, he said, "and I intend to demonstrate to him exactly how expensive that mistake was." Elowen absorbed that. She looked at her hands in her lap steady, both of them, which she was privately grateful for, and she thought about her father's face in the ballroom. The relief, the arithmetic, the way he had looked at her, the way you look at a line item that has been successfully transferred. "You should know," she said, that I am not going to be manageable. Cassian almost smiled. She could see the edge of it. I didn't come to the Alderwin Hotel tonight for something manageable, he said. The convoy drove north into the darkness, away from the lights of downtown, away from the hotel and the wedding and the 400 guests who were probably, at this exact moment, deciding together how they were going to describe what they just witnessed in terms that kept them comfortably outside the frame. Elowen watched Chicago disappear behind her. She had walked out of that ballroom under her own power. Whatever came next, that part was true. She was going to hold on to that. The estate materialized out of the darkness the way certain things materialize when you're already past the point of being surprised, not suddenly, but incrementally, piece by piece, until the complete picture assembled itself and you understood you had fundamentally underestimated the scale of what you'd walked into. Elowen saw the gates first, steel, reinforced, set into a stone perimeter wall that disappeared into the tree line on both sides. Security cameras at intervals. A guardhouse with 2 men who waved the convoy through without being asked, which meant they'd been notified, which meant everything about tonight had been planned in advance to a degree she was still calculating. Then the driveway, long gravel, flanked by mature oaks that had been growing here long before Cassian Rourke owned this land. Then the house itself. She had expected something designed to intimidate. Glass and angles, contemporary brutalism, the aesthetic of a man broadcasting power. Instead, Ravenhurst was stone and timber, 3 stories, sprawling rather than vertical, with deep-set windows that glowed amber from within. It looked like something built by someone who intended to stay. The vehicle stopped. Elowen did not wait for anyone to open her door. The cold hit her immediately sharper out here than in the city, cleaner, without the thermal mass of downtown to soften it. She stood on the gravel drive and looked up at the house and understood that whatever she'd been expecting, she hadn't been expecting this. A dog barked once from somewhere inside, deep, authoritative. One bark, then silence. Cassian came around the vehicle and stopped beside her without crowding her, which she noted. "You're cold," he said. "I'm fine. Your jaw is clenched." "My jaw is always clenched." She looked at the house. Is this where you explain the rules?" "In the morning." He moved toward the entrance. "Tonight you sleep," she almost argued on principle. The part of her that had been running on adrenaline since the ballroom wanted to push back against every directive, wanted to establish immediately and permanently that she was not a person to whom instructions were simply issued and received. But the other part, the part that had been standing in heels for 4 hours and had watched her entire family structure collapse in the space of 20 minutes, and was now standing in front of a heavily secured estate in the northern suburbs. Chicago at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in November, that part recognized that some battles needed to wait for daylight. She followed him inside. The interior was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and something else she couldn't immediately name. Coffee, maybe, paper. The particular settled smell of a space that had been occupied consistently and intentionally for years. The entry hall had stone floors and high ceilings, and a staircase that rose and turned at the landing. On the landing, she could see the dog. He was enormous. German Shepherd, but heavier than the breed standard, with a broad head and the particular watchful stillness of an animal that had been trained past mere obedience into something more like judgment. He was looking at her from the landing with amber eyes and the complete lack of performative emotion that well-trained dogs and very dangerous people shared. "Brutus," Cassian said. "Enough." The dog descended 3 steps, studied Elowen for a long moment with that amber gaze, then turned and walked back up. "Friendly," Elowen said. "He doesn't know you yet." A woman appeared from a hallway to the left. Late 50s, compact, with silver-streaked hair pulled back, and the expression of someone who had been managing difficult situations for so long that difficulty had stopped registering as a specific category and had become simply the texture of daily life. She looked at Elowen with something that wasn't warmth, but wasn't hostility either. It was the careful, neutral assessment of a professional deciding what category of problem she was dealing with. "Mrs. Hale," Cassian said. "She'll need the East Room." "It's ready." The woman looked at Elowen. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Hungry?" Elowen was, actually. She hadn't eaten at the wedding, because eating at the wedding would have required being stationary long enough for her father to find her and direct her toward whatever conversation he needed her to perform in. She said nothing. "There's food," Mrs. Hale said, as if the question had been answered. She turned and walked back down the hallway, apparently assuming Elowen would follow, which was the kind of assumption that usually annoyed her but which she was too tired to contest. Kitchen was large and functional, and aggressively undecorated compared to the rest of what she'd seen of the house. Elowen sat at a heavy wooden table and accepted a plate of food she didn't examine closely and ate it, and Mrs. Hale moved around the kitchen, doing things that didn't require acknowledgement, and after about 10 minutes she set a cup of tea on the table without being asked and left the room. Elowen sat alone in the kitchen of a crime boss's fortified estate, eating reheated food at midnight, and thought about her sister's face. The sorry eyes. She kept coming back to that. The money, the manipulation, the forgery. She didn't know about the forgery yet. That was coming. All of that she could process in its correct category of betrayal. But Maribel's face was something she couldn't yet fit into any category she had. Because sorry implied understanding, and understanding implied a choice, and the choice Maribel had made was to hold her husband's hand and stay exactly where she was. You could be sorry and still do nothing. Elowen had known that intellectually. It was different. Discovering you knew it personally. She drank the tea. She didn't taste it. She slept. The east room was neither a cell nor a suite. It was a bedroom, real, and furnished with the plain solidity of something chosen for function rather than impression. The bed was a double with a headboard in dark wood. There were curtains. There was a bathroom with actual towels. When she turned the lock from the inside, it locked. She checked it twice. She slept in her dress because she had nothing else, and she slept badly, and twice she surfaced from shallow dreams, with her heart already running before she remembered where she was, which was not the same as being reassured, but was at least better than not knowing. In the morning the house sounded different. There were voices, somewhere below men, brief exchanges, nothing she could make out clearly. The smell of coffee had reached the second floor. Outside the window, the grounds of Ravenhurst were visible in early gray light, the perimeter wall, the trees bare in November, a security camera rotating slowly on a post. A man crossed the gravel below, hands in his jacket pockets, and disappeared around a corner. Elowen washed her face, put her hair back with the elastic she'd had on her wrist, and went downstairs in yesterday's dress. Cassian was in a room off the main hall that she would later come to think of as the command center, though it didn't look like one from the outside, just a door, slightly heavier than the others, opening into a space that had been comprehensively converted from whatever it was originally into something that served a specific current purpose. 3 monitors on a long desk, a wall-mounted display, filing cabinets, actual physical ones, which surprised her. A table in the center with chairs. He was at the desk, jacket off, in a white shirt with the sleeves pushed up, reading something on one of the monitors. He heard her come in and didn't look up immediately, which told her he'd heard her on the stairs. "Coffee's there," he said. "I'm not interested in coffee." She walked to the center of the room and stopped. "I want to know what exactly my father took from you. I want to know what he told you about me. And I want to know what this," she gestured at the room, at the house, at the entirety of the situation, "is supposed to look like going forward." Cassian leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the calm of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had decided to let her set the pace. "Your father took a shipment," he said. "Logistics. Specific cargo moving through a port facility his company managed under a service contract with my organization. The shipment disappeared. The official explanation was a customs discrepancy. It wasn't. How much? The cargo itself, close to 4 million. The downstream consequences of losing it, the business relationships affected, the alternative arrangements required considerably more." Elowen pulled out a chair and sat down, and instead of the money, he offered me. "He offered you after the money, after the money, after the property, after 2 shipping routes and a warehouse facility." Cassian picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. None of those were actually his to offer. Most of what Garrick Voss has been presenting as assets past 3 years are substantially encumbered. Property is leveraged. The shipping routes are under federal review. The warehouse facility has a lien from a Belgian investment firm he borrowed from in 2021. He paused. You were the only unencumbered thing he had left to offer. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Elowen looked at the desk, the monitors, at the particular quality of morning light coming through the one window the room had. You said last night that you were going to demonstrate to him how expensive his mistake was, she said. Yes. That's not the whole reason you came to the Alderwin. Something moved in his expression. No. So tell me the rest. Stood up. He moved to the table, not the desk, and set something on it. A folder, manila, thick. He pushed it toward her without opening it and stayed on his side of the table. Elowen reached for it. She opened it. The first document was a corporate registration for an entity called North Star Registry Holdings, LLC. The registered state was Delaware. The filing date was 14 months ago. A sound like seen Stimu. She scanned the document with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent 4 years reading corporate filings and could extract the relevant information in seconds. The registered agent was a law firm she didn't recognize. The listed managing member was a name she did recognize. Her name, her signature at the bottom of the registration document, was hers. Or it was an extremely competent reproduction of hers, which in legal terms amounted to exactly the same thing. She turned the page. The second document was a shipping manifest from a port facility in Gary, Indiana, dated 11 months ago. Listed as the coordinating authority for customs clearance, North Star Registry Holdings, LLC. She turned another page. A bank account opened in North Star's name, with routing information and a statement showing transactions, significant ones, repeated, the pattern of regular commercial activity. She turned another page. A municipal contract for warehousing services, signed by North Star, countersigned by a city procurement officer she actually recognized from the archives. She turned another page and found a letter from the United States Attorney's Office, addressed to North Star Registry Holdings, requesting the voluntary production of documents related to an ongoing investigation into customs fraud and interstate transportation of prohibited goods. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago. Elowen sat very still. She was good at recognizing when a series of documents told a connected story. She was looking at a story that placed her, personally, at the center of a federal criminal investigation into a customs fraud operation that had been running for over a year. Assault seemed splitting, using a company she had allegedly founded and whose account she had allegedly managed and whose shipping arrangements she had allegedly coordinated. She had never heard of North Star Registry Holdings in her life. He set me up, she said. Her voice was very level. She was proud of that, distantly, in the way you're proud of small things, when larger things have temporarily overwhelmed your capacity for response. Federal investigators were planning to execute a search warrant on your apartment within 72 hours, Cassian said. He was watching her carefully, not with satisfaction, not with anything she could easily categorize. The documentation trail in the North Star records has been constructed to indicate that you were the primary architect of the operation. Not a participant, the architect. He forged everything. 14 months of documentation. Your signature appears on 43 separate instruments. Elowen closed the folder. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them and breathed through her nose. Her father had not merely traded her to resolve a debt. He had spent over a year constructing a criminal identity in her name, embedding her into a fraud operation, sophisticated enough to draw federal attention, and positioning her to absorb prosecution, while he maintained the appearance of a legitimate businessman whose operations had been compromised by a rogue employee, specifically by the employee who happened to be his daughter and whom he had long established as peripheral, quiet, professionally unremarkable, and therefore entirely plausible as someone operating invisibly beneath the family radar. It was, she recognized with a nausea that had nowhere to go, exactly the kind of thing her father was competent at. Not brilliant. Exactly, Garrick Voss was not a brilliant man. But he was methodical and patient and utterly unsentimental about the value of other people's well-being, when it conflicted with his own position. He had looked at her and seen a tool, and when the tool became a liability, he had scheduled it for disposal. "Why did you redirect the investigation?" she said. "You could have let it proceed. That would have destroyed my father without costing you anything. It would have destroyed you first. You don't know me." "I know what I observed," Cassian said. "Your father's operation and my organization's infrastructure are not cleanly separated. Federal investigators examining North Star's records would follow the trail. Some of where that trail leads is problematic for me. Removing you from the equation and dismantling the North Star structure serves my interests as well as yours. So this is mutual. Most useful things are." Elowen looked up at him. "And the rest of it? The word you said in the ballroom?" The room was quiet enough that she could hear the coffee maker in the kitchen down the hall, making its final sounds, the low gurgle of a machine completing its task. "That was a separate matter," Cassian said. "Explain it." "Later now." His jaw tightened fractionally. She caught it. "I've been watching Elowen Voss operate for 3 years," he said. "I've watched him in rooms, in negotiations, at events where he brings his family as social currency. I've watched how he uses Maribel and how he dismisses you, and I've watched you in those rooms not performing the dismissal the way a person performs being dismissed when they've accepted the story. You were watching every time, the way I watch rooms." Elowen said nothing. "When I understood what he was building with North Star, and understood what he intended to do with it, I made a decision." Cassian picked up his coffee again. "The word was a message to him, not a description of you." "It sounded like a description of me." "I know." He met her eyes. "That was a mistake in execution. I don't make many. That one I'll acknowledge." She hadn't expected the acknowledgement. It arrived in the room with the slightly awkward weight of something genuine, unpolished, not rehearsed. She filed it. "What do you actually want from me?" she said. He crossed to the desk and pulled up a document on the monitor. "I want you to do what you do," he said. "Your father's construction is sophisticated enough that dismantling it requires someone who understands how it was built. You understand bureaucratic architecture, municipal records, corporate registration systems, permit cross-referencing. My accountants understand money. They don't understand the paper infrastructure the money hides inside. You want me to work for you, with me, toward the destruction of my father's fraudulent empire, toward the separation of fraudulent documentation from legitimate business infrastructure. Yes. Several hundred people work in the legitimate side of Voss Meridian logistics. They did nothing wrong. If the whole structure collapses without surgical intervention, they lose their jobs, their pensions, potentially their health coverage. I'm not interested in that outcome." Elowen looked at him for a long time. She was aware that she was being asked to trust a man whose primary qualification for trustworthiness was that he had demonstrated himself to be slightly less willing to sacrifice her than her own family. That was a low bar. It was also currently the highest bar in the room. "I want access to secure municipal databases," she said. "Not your copies. Actual access, my own credentials. I can arrange read-only access through a secured connection. I want 3 monitors. Done. I want the complete Voss Meridian financial record. Everything your people have collected. Not the summary. The raw data. You'll have it today. And I want to know," she stopped. "What?" "I want to know what you told the federal investigators to redirect the search warrant." Cassian set down his coffee. There was something in the small hesitation before he answered that she cataloged carefully, the way she cataloged everything. "I provided them with documentation suggesting the North Star registration was executed through identity theft of a municipal employee who had no knowledge of the entity," he said. "Supporting that documentation required creating certain records that did not previously exist. You fabricated evidence. I corrected an injustice using the tools available to me. That is a very specific way of saying that you fabricated evidence." "Yes," Elowen exhaled. "So I owe my current legal safety to forged exculpatory records. Temporarily, the goal is to build a legitimate evidentiary record that makes the fabricated version unnecessary." He held her gaze. "That's what the next few weeks are for." She looked at the folder on the table. at her own forged signature on 43 separate documents, at the architecture of what her father had constructed around her name while she spent 4 years cataloging other people's paper trails in a municipal office, being careful, being quiet, being professionally impeccable, being invisible. She thought about Maribel's sorry eyes. She thought about Garrick's face, the relief, the arithmetic. She thought about standing in that ballroom with 400 people and nobody moving. "Show me the Voss Meridian records," she said. Cassian moved to the desk. He pulled up the first file. It was a shipping manifest from 18 months ago, and Elowen looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before she saw the first inconsistency, a cargo classification that didn't match the corresponding port of origin documentation, and reached past him to scroll down, and the work began. She didn't acknowledge that she'd made a decision. There was no moment of declaration, no speech, no scene setting. She just started reading, the way she always started reading when she was in front of documents that were lying to her, and the room organized itself around that. By the time Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway at noon with lunch she hadn't asked for, Elowen had built a running document of 47 discrepancies across 6 months of shipping records, and she had not looked up once. Cassian had not left the room. Brutus had come downstairs at some point and was sitting near the door with the particular patient posture of an animal deciding whether the new element in his environment required continued monitoring. He hadn't made a sound. He was just present, which was its own form of judgment. Mrs. Hale set 2 plates on the table, looked at the screens, looked at Elowen, and left without comment. "There are 47 instances in the first 6 months alone," Elowen said, not looking up from the monitor, "where the cargo classification on the shipping manifest does not match the port authority documentation. That's not random error. Random error produces a mixed pattern. This is a directional pattern. Every discrepancy moves the classification in the same direction, toward categories with lower customs scrutiny. Someone with a very thorough understanding of customs classification systems designed this deliberately." "Yes," Cassian said. "This wasn't my father." She looked up. "Garrick understands logistics as a business. He doesn't understand customs classification systems at this level of technical detail. Someone else built this architecture." Cassian's expression shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. Something tightened around his eyes. "Who's your customs compliance director?" she said. Silence. "In your organization, the person responsible for managing the documentation on shipments moving through your network, who actually runs that operation day to day." "Man named Devereaux," Cassian said. "He's been with the organization for 11 years. "Show me his personnel record, Elowen. Show me his record." Another silence, different quality. She had said his name without thinking about it, without the formal buffer of a title or a last name, and the word had come out with the unconscious ease of someone who had already, somewhere in the machinery of the morning, stopped treating the distance between them as fixed. Cassian noticed. She knew he noticed, because he went very still for half a second, in the particular way of someone absorbing new information and deciding how to respond to it. He pulled up the personnel record. Elowen looked at it. Then she looked at 3 more shipping manifests. Then she went back to the personnel record. Then she pulled up a municipal contractor database she'd accessed through her archive credentials and ran a search she didn't explain out loud. The result came back in 11 seconds. "Devereaux," she said, and her voice had changed, not louder, not more emotional, but flatter, which in her case was a sign that something significant had shifted in her assessment of the situation. "His home address. Run it against your property records database. You have everything else." She looked at him directly. "Run it." Cassian reached past her and typed something. The result came up. He looked at it. She watched his face. "That property," she said, "is registered to a shell company called Palladian Asset Management. I found Palladian in the municipal contractor routes 6 minutes ago. It appears once as a subcontractor on a port facility renovation project in 2019, and once as the listed vendor for a warehousing services agreement that was executed out of North Star Registry Holdings 8 months ago. The room was very quiet. Devereaux built Northstar, she said. Not for my father. He built it for himself, used my father's logistics network as the operational infrastructure, used my father's debt to you as leverage to redirect attention, and used my name as the terminal liability point because I was available, expendable. And my father was already too financially desperate to ask questions about whose idea the structure actually was. Cassian stood up from the desk. He stood up slowly, and there was something in the quality of that movement controlled. Deliberate, the movement of a man applying significant discipline to a significant impulse that Elowen recognized as the physical expression of a very specific kind of anger. Not the hot kind, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't dissipate. Devereaux is currently in this building, he said. I know, Elowen said. I heard his voice this morning. You introduced him as your compliance director when he brought you documents at 9. I recognized the pattern of his speech from the margin notes on 3 of the shipping manifests. Cassian looked at her. It was a long look. She held it. He's been with me for 11 years, he said. I know. He's been building this for at least 2 of them. At least, she said. Possibly 3. The earliest Palladian transaction I can find is from 21 months ago, but the company itself may predate that activity. Cassian moved to the door. Wait, Elowen said. He stopped. If you confront him now, before we have the complete picture, he'll know what you know, and he'll destroy whatever we haven't found yet. She turned back to the monitor. Give me 72 hours. The silence behind her lasted long enough that she wasn't sure he was still in the room. Then 72 hours, and don't let him see me. He doesn't know I can read those manifests. That's the only advantage we have right now, and I'm not giving it up. Another silence. Agreed, Cassian said. His footsteps crossed the stone floor, and the door closed behind him with the quiet, controlled click of someone exercising enormous restraint about how hard they wanted to close it. Elowen turned back to the screens. She was aware that she had just, in the space of a single morning, agreed to dismantle her father's empire, discovered that her father's empire had itself been partly dismantled by a subordinate who'd used her as his exit strategy, and committed to 72 hours of covert forensic work inside the household of a man whose own organization had a traitor in it. She was also aware that she had stopped thinking of Cassian Rourke as a threat approximately 3 hours ago, and had started thinking of him as something she didn't have a clean word for yet. Brutus walked across the room and lay down under her desk. She looked at him. He put his head on his paws and closed his eyes, with the immovable calm of an animal that had rendered its verdict. Elowen turned back to the documents. On the screen, Palladian Asset Management's transaction history was still loading, pulling records from 3 different databases simultaneously. A sound like green wood splitting, and she could already see in the first visible entries the shape of something larger and more deliberate than she'd initially calculated. She understood, with the same bone-level certainty she always felt when a document trail revealed its true architecture, that what she was looking at was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something that was going to require her to go much further than she had originally intended, to cross lines she had not originally planned to cross, and to make choices that would permanently alter whatever version of herself she'd been before the ballroom doors came open. She pulled the next file. The 72 hours did not go cleanly. Elowen had known they wouldn't. She had worked in a municipal archive long enough to understand that document trails rarely cooperated with the timelines imposed on them. A sound that the deeper you went into a constructed financial structure, the more the structure revealed itself to be layered, rather than linear, each layer containing another layer beneath it. And the experience of excavating it was less like pulling a thread, and more like discovering that what you'd taken for a thread was actually the edge of a net. By the end of the first day, she had mapped Palladian Asset Management's complete transaction history across 4 jurisdictions. By the end of the second, she had identified 3 additional shell entities connected to Palladian through shared registered agents, overlapping bank routing numbers, and a pattern of incorporation dates that clustered around the same 2-week windows in consecutive years, the signature of a single person managing multiple registrations simultaneously and doing it efficiently. Enough that a casual examiner would miss the rhythm. Devereaux was not a casual operator. That was the thing that kept surfacing as she worked, the fact she kept having to sit with and then set aside in order to keep moving. The person who had built this structure was genuinely skilled. Not in the way that amateurs were sometimes accidentally skilled, producing something complicated through excess of effort. Devereaux had done this with economy and precision, the way a person does something they have done before, possibly many times, and possibly many places. She was on her third day of nearly continuous work when she found the Chicago connection. Not the Voss Meridian connection, she'd had that from the beginning. The other Chicago connection. The one that had nothing to do with Garrick, Voss, and everything to do with why Devereaux had chosen this particular organization, this particular moment, this particular arrangement. She was cross-referencing a Palladian banking instrument against a database of municipal contractor records when a name appeared in the associated documentation that made her stop typing. She looked at the name for a full 10 seconds. A sound like green wood splitting. Then she picked up the single-burner phone Cassian had left on the desk 3 days ago with the instruction that she use it if she found something time-sensitive, and she called the only number stored in it. He answered on the second ring. "Come down here," she said. "How bad," he said. She looked at the screen, at the name, at what the name connected to, and what that connection implied about the last 3 years of activity in this organization. "Come down here now," she said. He was in the room in 4 minutes, which told her he'd been somewhere close, which told her he hadn't been sleeping, which told her she was not the only person in this house who had been running on something other than rest for the past 72 hours. He came in and looked at her face before he looked at the screen, and what he read in her face made him close the door behind him. "Show me," he said. She turned the monitor toward him. The name on the screen was Marcus Vale. She watched Cassian's face as he read it, watched for the recognition, and it came not dramatically, not a flinch or a recoil, but a very specific quality of stillness that arrived in his features like weather. "Explain it," he said. "Vale is listed as a signatory on a Palladian banking instrument from 16 months ago," she said. "A wire authorization for $430,000 moving from a Palladian account to an account held by a consulting entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The consulting entity's name is Meridian Cross Partners." She paused. Meridian Cross Partners was established 9 days after Voss Meridian Logistics signed its first service contract with your organization. Cassian did not move. "Marcus Vale," she continued, because she needed to say it completely, and she needed him to hear all of it, according to the personnel records you gave me access to, has been your chief legal counsel for 7 years. He manages your organization's corporate compliance, contract review, and regulatory interface. He would have been the person who reviewed and approved the Voss Meridian service contract. "Yes," Cassian said. His voice had gone somewhere flat and very quiet, the vocal equivalent of the stillness in his face. He was also, based on the documentation I'm looking at, the person who introduced Devereaux to the Palladian structure. There's a communication record here. She pulled up the second monitor, a series of encrypted message logs that your IT team apparently collected as part of a routine security sweep 14 months ago, but never fully decoded. I ran the decryption on the message headers this morning. The content requires a key I don't have, but the metadata is visible. Date stamps, duration, recipient identifiers. Devereaux and Vale communicated through an encrypted channel 47 times in the 4 months before the first Palladian transaction. Cassian walked to the table and put both hands flat on it and looked at the screen. Elowen watched him. She had spent 3 days in this room, learning to read the micro-expressions of a man who had spent decades learning not to have micro-expressions, and what she was reading now was not anger, in any form she recognized from her father, or from the men her father had brought into their home over the years. It was something colder and more structural, like watching a building's load-bearing calculations change in real time. "Vale drafted the Voss Meridian contract," Cassian said. "Yes. He would have built the service terms that gave Garrick access to the port facility documentation, the customs classification protocols, the shipping manifest procedures. Yes. And he would have known, when those protocols were being manipulated, exactly what was happening and exactly how to frame the paper trail so that the manipulation read as contractor error rather than deliberate fraud. Cassian lifted his hands from the table and straightened up. "Where is he now?" Elowen said. "Vale. Is he in this building?" "He was here yesterday morning for a meeting." Cassian crossed to the door. "He left in the afternoon. Does he know you've been working with me? Does he know what I've been doing in this room?" Cassian stopped with his hand on the door. She saw it in his posture before he answered, the fractional tightening across his shoulders, the way his grip on the door handle adjusted. "He knows you're here," Cassian said. "That's not what I asked. He was present when I told 2 members of my senior staff that you were assisting with a records review." He turned around. "I didn't specify the scope, but he's your chief legal counsel. He would have asked." He did ask. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were reviewing your father's shipping records to assist with the debt resolution." Elowen looked at him, and he accepted that. He seemed to. "He didn't accept it," she said. "He accepted what you told him while calculating what it meant that you were telling him that. A man who has spent 14 months building a covert structure inside your organization does not hear that a woman with deep document analysis skills is sitting in your records room and simply accept the explanation." She turned back to the screen. "He knows I'm looking. He may not know exactly what I've found, but he knows I'm looking, and he's known it for at least the last 48 hours, and he has 48 hours worth of a head start on whatever he's been doing to manage that." The silence in the room was different from previous silences. It had a specific texture, the texture of a situation that had just revealed itself to be further along than anyone had understood it to be. Cassian said, "What does he need to protect himself?" "Access to the Palladian accounts to move or destroy the money trail. Access to the encrypted communication logs before I decode the content. And—" She stopped. "What?" She was looking at the screen, at a document she'd pulled up 20 minutes before calling him. A document she had been sitting with while she decided how to present what it contained. "There's a third party," she said, "in the Meridian Cross Communications metadata. A third recipient identifier that appears in 11 of the 47 messages. Not Devereaux, not Vale, someone else. Who? I don't have a name yet. The identifier is a randomly generated alphanumeric string with no direct registry match. But the communication pattern is different from the Devereaux-Vale exchanges. Those are operational frequency and duration, suggest logistics, coordination, problem solving. The exchanges with this third identifier are shorter and more widely spaced. Monthly, roughly. The pattern of a reporting relationship. Someone above Vale," Cassian said. "Someone Vale reports to. Someone who has been receiving updates on the Palladian operations progress for at least a year." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "You think it's someone in my organization?" "I think it's someone with enough standing that Vale is comfortable reporting to them, which means or someone outside your organization with leverage over Vale, or someone inside it with authority over him." She looked up from the screen. "Who does Marcus Vale answer to?" "He answers to me." "Directly? No intermediary? No senior partner structure within the legal team?" "There's a team of 4 attorneys. Vale leads them." Cassian's jaw had the tight set she associated with him, processing information he didn't want to be receiving. "He reports directly to me. Then either someone outside your organization has been running him for over a year, or someone I trust more than Vale has been running him," Cassian said. He said it flatly, the way you say something you've worked out and don't want to work out, but have worked out anyway. "Yes," Elowen said. The morning was gray through the single window, and neither of them was looking at it. Brutus had lifted his head from the floor and was watching the room with his amber eyes in the particular way of an animal that registers tension through the air before humans name it. "I need the complete organizational chart," Elowen said. "Every senior position, reporting structure, how long each person has been in place, who recruited them, and any personnel changes in the 18 months preceding the first Palladian transaction." "Elowen." Something in his voice made her look up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, and she spent a half-second categorizing it not doubt, not resistance. something freeing, but something in the neighborhood of what it looks like when someone who has been maintaining a particular structure realizes the structure has been compromised at a depth they hadn't accounted for. And the realization is not just strategic, but personal. There are 12 senior positions, he said. I have known some of those people for 15 years. I know, she said. Whoever this third identifier belongs to has been in this organization for long enough to establish the kind of trust that Vale would report to them without question. That narrows it considerably. Yes, and narrows it to people. He stopped. I know, she said, again quietly. She did know. She knew exactly what it felt like to discover that the people you had organized your understanding of safety around had been constructing something else behind that understanding. She'd had the tutorial on that 3 days ago in this same room, looking at 43 documents with her own forged signature. Get me the chart, she said. He left the room. He was gone for 20 minutes. In that time, Elowen kept working, running the third identifier against every database she had access to, trying to find a registry match, a pattern, any anchor point that could connect the alphanumeric string to a real-world entity. She found nothing direct. What she found instead was a secondary pattern she hadn't noticed before the third identifier's communications did not originate from the same encrypted platform as the Devereaux-Vale exchanges. They came through a different channel entirely, one with a different techno-signature, which meant whoever was on the other end was not using the same operational infrastructure as Devereaux, which meant they were careful enough to maintain separation, which meant they had done this before. Cassian came back with a folder. He put it on the table and stayed standing while she opened it and went through it, which she did quickly, running the names and tenures and recruitment histories against the timeline she had built over 3 days. She got to the 7th name and stopped. The name was Henrik Solis. Chief of Operations, 11 years in position. Recruited directly by Cassian's predecessor, his father, 4 years before Cassian inherited the organization. Responsible for coordinating between the organization's legitimate business operations and its other activities. The position that would have the most comprehensive visibility into both the shipping infrastructure and the legal compliance function. The position that Marcus Vale, as chief legal counsel, would most naturally report to on operational matters, not formally, not on the chart, but practically, in the way organizations actually work, where formal reporting structures describe one layer of authority and informal ones describe another. Solas, she said. Cassian went very still. Tell me about him, she said. He's been with this organization longer than I have, Cassian said. His voice was careful, in a way it hadn't been before. He worked for my father for 4 years. He was the person who managed the operational transition when my father died. He's the person who... He stopped. Who what? Who helped me hold the organization together in the first 18 months, Cassian said. When I was 26 and had just inherited a criminal organization and had no functional idea how any of it worked. Solis was the operational memory. He knew every relationship, every arrangement, every implicit agreement that had never been written down. Without him, I would not have survived the first year. Elowen looked at the name on the paper. Then she looked at Cassian. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who was not in control of the room he was standing in. Not defeated, Cassian Rourke was not a person who moved through defeat, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of someone who has just had the floor of a room they've been standing in for a decade reveal itself as different material than they thought. I need to confirm it before you do anything, she said. I need to decode those communication logs. How long? I have 11 of the 14 message header elements. The decryption key structure has 3 remaining components. The key follows the pattern I've identified. I can brute force the remaining components in. She looked at the screen, at the running calculation she'd set going 40 minutes ago, 3 to 4 hours. You have 3, Cassian said. Why 3? Because Solis has a standing weekly briefing with the full senior staff at noon, and if he is what you think he is, he will use that briefing to read the room. And if he reads it wrong, he'll move, Elowen said. He'll move the money and destroy the logs. Yes. She turned back to the screen. The calculation was running. She pulled up 2 additional processing windows and split the workload across 3 simultaneous decryption attempts using different parameter assumptions for the remaining key components, which was not the most elegant approach, but was the fastest, and speed was currently the only metric that mattered. Cassian sat down on the other side of the table. He did not speak. He did not look at his phone. He sat with his hands loosely interlaced in front of him and watched the screens with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with understanding what was on the screens and everything to do with needing to be in the room where it was happening. Brutus got up, crossed the room, and lay down at Cassian's feet. An hour passed. The first decryption attempt returned a key error. Elowen adjusted the parameters and relaunched it. The second attempt was still running. The third had stalled on a character. Set mismatch, she corrected in 4 minutes. Your father, she said, not looking away from the screen. How did he die? The question arrived in the room without preamble, which was the only way she knew how to ask questions she actually needed. Answered. Cardiac event, Cassian said. He was 58. He had a history of heart problems. Was it investigated? Silence, Cassian. It was investigated, he said. The conclusion was natural causes. The medical examiner found no evidence of intervention. Who arranged the medical examiner? Another silence, longer. Who managed the logistics of the investigation? She said. The organizational side. Who interfaced with the authorities, coordinated the timeline, managed the information? Solas, Cassian said. He said it the way you say something that has been sitting in the back of a room in your mind for a long time and has just been walked forward into the light. Not a revelation, a confirmation of something that had never been permitted to fully form before. Solas managed everything. I was 26. I didn't know how to manage any of it. He managed it for you. Yes. And positioned himself as indispensable in the process. Yes. Elowen kept her eyes on the screen. I'm not saying your father was killed. I'm saying that a man who has been systematically building a covert financial structure inside your organization for at least 2 years, using your chief legal counsel as an operational intermediary, and using a logistics contractor's debt to create criminal liability for an innocent third party, that man has been planning this for longer than 2 years. The 2 years is when the documentation starts, not when the plan started. The second decryption attempt returned a result, not a key error. A result. The message content window populated. Elowen leaned forward and read the first decoded message. Then the second. Then she stopped reading sequentially and started scanning, the way she scanned documents when she needed the shape of the whole thing before the detail of any part of it. She read for 4 minutes. Then she sat back. What? Cassian said. He's been planning to leave for 3 years, she said. Not just skimming, not just building a parallel income stream. He's been planning a complete exit, liquidating his stake in the organization's legitimate assets, moving the money through Palladian and Meridian Cross into untouchable offshore positions. And she stopped. And what? She looked at him, and he's been in communication with a federal organized crime task force for 18 months. He's been providing them with information about your organization in exchange for immunity and witness relocation. The room became completely silent. He's cooperating with federal investigators, she said, because she needed to say it plainly, needed to not let it stay in the language of implication. He's been building a case against you for 1.5 years. The North Star structure, my father, my name, all of it, that wasn't just about money. It was about giving the federal investigation a secondary target to pursue while he finished moving his assets. The investigation of North Star would have consumed federal resources and attention, bought him additional months to complete the transfer, and she stopped again. And implicated me through my organization's connection to the Voss Meridian contract, Cassian said. Yes. The federal case he's been building places the North Star fraud at the center of your organization's operations. When prosecutors look at North Star, they see your shipping infrastructure. When they look at your shipping infrastructure, they see Solas's operational management. When they look at Solas, they see a cooperating witness who has already agreed to testify, Cassian said. Who has already, according to the last 3 message exchanges, provided sworn statements to a federal grand jury. The last sentence went into the room like a stone into water, and everything rippled outward from it. Cassian stood up. He crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the gray November grounds of Ravenhurst, at the wall and the trees and the camera rotating on its post, and he was still the absolute stillness of a man applying every tool he had to the problem of remaining functional in the face of something that threatened to make functionality very difficult. Elowen waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent her entire life in rooms where the most important things were happening at the level beneath the surface, and she had learned that the surface required patience. "He'll know by tonight," Cassian said finally, without turning around. "If he's been monitoring the situation, and he has, he's been monitoring everything. He'll know by tonight that Vale has been identified. He'll know that we're close. Yes, he'll trigger his exit. Yes, whatever his prearranged protocol is with the federal handlers, he'll initiate it. They'll move him. And when they move him, they take the sworn grand jury testimony with them. And you. I become the primary target," Cassian said. "With no cooperating witness to negotiate against, and no North Star structure to offer as a counterweight, because by that point, Solus will have already handed the federal investigators everything they need to. Treat North Star as your operation rather than his." Turned around. His face was, she searched for the right word and couldn't find one that was precise enough. Composed on the surface, it's the way expensive buildings are composed, even when everything structural ends inside them is under stress. But underneath the composition, something that was not quite despair and not quite rage, and was more like the expression of a person looking at a field they thought was solid ground, and understanding it had always been water. "My father's organization," he said, 11 years. Every decision I made, every arrangement, every relationship. All of it reviewed, managed, filtered through a man who was building a case against me while I thanked him for keeping the lights on." "Yes," Elowen said, because there was nothing else to say, and he wasn't asking for consolation, and she didn't insult him by offering it. "What do I have?" he said. "What do we have that actually helps?" Elowen turned to the screens. She thought about it, not performing consideration, actually thinking, running the evidentiary inventory against the timeline, against what the federal investigators likely had and what they likely didn't have yet. "We have the decoded message logs," she said. "Every communication between Solas, Vale, and Devereaux for 14 months. Those logs show the construction of the North Star structure from the inside. They show that the structure was built by Solas, using Devereaux as the operational lead, and Vale as the legal architect, not by you, not on your instruction, not with your knowledge. Is that enough to counter a grand jury statement? Alone? No. But the logs also contain something else." She pulled up a specific message, the 9th decoded exchange, between Solus and the federal handler identifier. "Solus has been providing the investigators with documents he represents as originating from your personal files. Records he claims you generated and retained. The federal case against you is built substantially on those documents. And if those documents fabricated the same the North Star structure, using the same methods, with the same technical signatures," she looked at him. "Then the federal case is built on manufactured evidence, provided by a cooperating witness with a demonstrable history of document fraud. That doesn't automatically collapse their case. But it creates enough evidentiary doubt to make prosecution substantially more complicated, and it gives a competent defense attorney grounds to challenge the credibility of every piece of material Solas provided. Can you prove they're fabricated? I can prove the technical signatures match. Whether a court accepts that proof depends on a lot of things we can't control," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back at him. They were standing in a room full of evidence of a betrayal that was 3 years deep, in a house that had been compromised before she ever arrived in it, facing a timeline measured in hours, and neither of them had slept properly in 3 days. And the coffee had gone cold on the desk, and Brutus was watching them both from the floor, with those amber eyes that communicated nothing except the patient certainty that he would follow. Whatever came next, wherever it led. "Tell me what you need," Cassian said. "Direct access to your organization's full document archive." Not the subset you gave me, all of it. She held his gaze. And I need Devereaux. Why Devereaux? Because Devereaux is the weakest link in this structure. He built the operational infrastructure, but he was following Solis's design. He's going to understand, when this collapses, that Solis will sacrifice him first. If I can get him in this room in the next 2 hours before Solis triggers his exit, I can get him to authenticate the decoded logs. A voluntary authentication statement from a participant in the scheme, even a guilty one, changes the evidentiary picture significantly. You want to flip him. I want to give him the option to be the person who cooperated voluntarily rather than the person who was caught after the fact. Those are very different positions in federal sentencing guidelines, and I need him to understand the difference clearly enough to make the right choice quickly. Cassian studied her. You've never done anything like this before, he said. No, she said. I've spent 4 years reading documents that describe what happens when people don't make that choice. That's sufficient. Something moved in his expression again, that same fractional shift she'd caught in the vehicle 3 nights ago, in the dim red light of the Chicago stoplight. She still didn't have a precise name for it. Devereaux is in the building, Cassian said. I know, he's been here all week. Solis asked him to stay on site. He paused. I thought that was Solis being operational, making sure documentation was available. It was Solis keeping him close enough to manage, in case something went wrong. She looked at the screen. Something went wrong. Cassian moved toward the door. Cassian. She said his name the same way she'd said it that first morning, without the buffer of formality, with the directness of someone who had stopped treating distance as fixed. When Devereaux comes in, you don't speak unless I ask you to. He turned. I need him to be looking at me, she said. Not at you. He'll calculate survival odds against you differently than he'll calculate them against me, and I need him calculating clearly. It was the longest silence yet. Agreed, he said. He left. Elowen turned back to the screens and pulled up the federal sentencing guidelines for customs, fraud, and conspiracy, which she had first read 4 years ago in an unrelated archival context and had never expected to need for personal application, and she read through them again with the focused attention of a woman who had just understood that the next 20 minutes were going to determine not just the outcome of this investigation, but the survival of the man who had, for reasons she was still fully processing, decided that she was worth pulling out of a ballroom. The door opened. Devereaux was shorter than she'd expected from his voice. Compact, 50-something, with the careful grooming of a man who used external presentation as a form of control. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. She had positioned herself deliberately, with the monitors arranged so that the decoded message logs were visible from where he would have to stand. And she watched his face complete its rapid assessment of the situation. He looked at Cassian behind him. Then he looked at her. Sit down, Elowen said. He sat down. She turned one of the monitors to face him directly and let him read for 30 seconds without speaking. Because 30 seconds of reading the decoded content of his own communications was worth more than any opening she could deliver, and she needed the first words out of his mouth to be reactive rather than defensive. He read. His face went through 4 distinct stages in those 30 seconds: recognition, calculation, something she could only describe as a specific quality of exhaustion that arrives when the thing you've been moving for months finally materializes, and then, and this was the one she'd been waiting for, the particular settling expression of a man who has run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion he doesn't like but can work with. He looked up from the screen. How much time do I have? He said. And Elowen understood, with the bone-level certainty she felt when a document trail finally resolved into its true shape, that they were going to get through the next 20 minutes, and that what came after was going to be something she had not yet fully imagined but would need to become. Because the version of herself that had stood at the window of the Alderwin Hotel 12 days ago was not the version capable of finishing what she had started. She pulled the authentication she'd drafted that morning from the folder beneath the desk. Less than you think, she said. Devereaux signed the authentication statement at 11:47 in the morning. He did not negotiate. He did not posture. He read the form Elowen had drafted with the focused attention of a man who understood legal instruments and found this one to be precisely what it claimed, to be a voluntary authentication of the decoded communication logs, attesting to their accuracy and to his participation in the Palladian structure under the direction of Henrik Solis. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He picked up the pen and signed where she indicated, and initialed the attached log pages one by one with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has decided that speed is now the only currency with any value. When he finished, he put the pen down and looked at her. Solis has a protocol, he said, pre-arranged with his federal handlers. A phrase he sends through a specific channel. They move him within 6 hours of receiving it. Has he sent it? Not as of this morning. But Devereaux looked at his watch. The senior staff briefing started 8 minutes ago. If he reads the room and decides the situation has changed, he'll send it from his phone before he leaves that meeting. Elowen was already moving. She crossed the room to the door and opened it, and Cassian was in the hall, which she had expected, because he had not actually gone far, which she had also expected. The briefing, she said. I know. He was already moving down the hall. Stay here, Cassian. Stay here. He said it without breaking stride, without looking back. And there was something in the quality of the instruction that was not the controlling directive of a man managing a captive, but the urgent instruction of a man trying to keep something he valued out of the immediate blast radius. Stayed. For 40 seconds. Then she followed. The briefing room was on the ground floor, East Wing, a room she had walked past 3 times in the past week, without going in. She could hear voices before she reached the door, multiple, overlapping, the particular acoustic signature of a meeting that has just been disrupted. She pushed the door open. 7 people around a table. Cassian standing at the head of it, not seated, which communicated everything about how this meeting had been reoriented from its original purpose this late. 6 faces turning toward the door as she entered, ranging across expressions from surprise to wariness to the careful blankness of people who had learned not to show immediate reactions. And Henrik Solis. He was at the far end of the table, and he was the only person in the room who did not look at her when she entered. He was looking at Cassian with the particular focused attention of a man taking a rapid reading of a situation that had just become significantly more complicated than he'd assessed 30 seconds ago. He was 63 years old and looked like someone's retired uncle, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a large plain face and hands that looked like they belonged to someone who had done physical work earlier in life and had never entirely shed the evidence of it. He was wearing a dark blue suit that fit well without being showy. There was nothing about his appearance that communicated danger, which Elowen understood immediately was the most dangerous thing about him. On the table in front of him, face down, was his phone. Elowen. Cassian said her name without inflection, which was a kind of instruction. She crossed the room and set the folder on the table. Not in front of Solis, in the center where everyone could see it. This is a record of communications between Henrik Solis, Marcus Vale, and an operative named Devereaux, conducted over a 14-month period through an encrypted channel on this organization's network, she said. She said it to the room, not to Solis specifically, which was a choice. The communications document the construction of a fraudulent shell corporation called Palladian Asset Management, the subsequent creation of a second entity called North Star Registry Holdings, registered in my name without my knowledge, and the systematic provision of fabricated evidence about this organization's operations to a federal organized crime task force. The room was very quiet. They also document, she continued, a prearranged cooperation agreement between Henrik Solis and federal investigators, under which Solis has provided sworn grand jury testimony in exchange for immunity and witness relocation. 6 faces at the table moved through their respective calculations. Solis did not move at all. These communications have been authenticated by a signatory participant, Elowen said. The authentication statement is in this folder. A copy has already been transmitted to an attorney retained by Cassian's organization for purposes of this proceeding. She stopped. The silence held for 3 seconds. Then Solis picked up his phone from the table. Cassian moved faster than she would have predicted. For a man his size, not toward Solis, but toward the door. A single gesture to someone in the hall, and two of his security personnel were in the room before Solis had the phone unlocked. "Put it down," Cassian said. Solis looked at him across the length of the table. In that look was 11 years of shared history, and Elowen, watching from 3 feet away, could see both men navigating the specific wreckage of it in real time. Cassian's face was doing the thing it did when he was applying maximum discipline to maximum feeling. Solis's face was doing something else, not guilt. Nothing as simple as guilt, but a kind of careful resignation. The expression of a man who has run a complex operation for a long time and is now performing the assessment of whether the terminal contingency has actually been reached. He put the phone down. "Sit," Cassian said, to the 6 other people at the table. "All of you, we're not done." He picked up Solas's phone. He looked at it, at the screen, still unlocked, at the message application open on it, at the text field with a phrase already typed and not yet sent. He read it. His jaw tightened once, then released. He set the phone on the table and looked at Solas. "You were going to let me take the federal case," Cassian said. "Everything you gave them. All of it pointing at me." "Yes," Solas said, "just that. No elaboration, no defensive architecture, no reframing." Elowen noted it, the honesty of a man who has calculated that performance is no longer useful. 11 years, Cassian said. 11 years, Solis agreed. "My father trusted you." Something moved in Solis's face. Elowen caught it and filed it immediately, not guilt, but something in the vicinity of it, something that was specifically about the mention of Cassian's father, and not about anything else in the room. It was the only moment of visible feeling she would see from him in the next 3 hours. "Your father was a different kind of man," Solis said. "What you built was never going to survive what's coming for this industry. Federal reorganization, Port Authority restructuring, new surveillance infrastructure. I've seen internal briefings for 5 years. The window for operating the way your father operated is closing. I built an exit. I built it carefully. I built it without burning anything I didn't have to burn." "You burned me," Cassian said. "I was going to burn you minimally. Case I built gives them enough to satisfy a prosecution without necessarily resulting in—" "Stop." Cassian's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that has mass. "Stop talking about it like it was a favor." Solis closed his mouth. The room held its configuration 6 staff members, in various states of controlled shock, 2 security personnel at the door, Cassian at the head of the table, Solis at the far end, and Elowen, standing to the side where she could see everyone, which was where she had positioned herself deliberately. "What do you need?" Solis said after a moment. "From me." "What does this?" He glanced at Elowen without expression. "Require from me, specifically." "Everything," Elowen said. "Every document you provided the federal investigators. The original files, the fabricated versions, and the transmission records showing how and when you provided them. Every communication with your federal handlers. The specific immunity agreement terms. If I provide that, my cooperation agreement, your cooperation agreement becomes void the moment those investigators understand you provided fabricated evidence as part of your sworn testimony," she said. "You're not negotiating from a position of having something to protect. You're negotiating from a position of choosing between 2 kinds of exposure. And the only version of this that doesn't end with you facing federal evidence tampering charges on top of everything else is the version where you cooperate with us before your handlers understand what you actually gave them." Solis looked at her for a long time. She held it. "You're not law enforcement," he said. "No, you're not an attorney. No, you're a municipal archivist who has been in this building for 2 weeks. "Yes," she said. "And I decoded your communication logs, identified your shell structure, flipped your operational lead, a sound like green wood splitting, and drafted the authentication instrument that is currently sitting in a secure transmission queue addressed to 3 separate legal entities. Time to send in." She looked at her watch. 41 minutes unless I cancel it. "So, the municipal archivist is the person you're talking to. I'd suggest focusing on that rather than my professional credentials." Something shifted in Solis's careful face. Not respect, exactly. but the specific recalibration that happens when someone who has been underestimating a variable in their calculation is forced to update their model. He looked at Cassian. She stays in the room, Solus said. She's not going anywhere, Cassian said. Solus reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small USB drive, which he set on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man making a consequential gesture and wanting it to register correctly. He looked at Elowen. Everything is on there, he said. Original files, modified versions, transmission logs, the handler contact protocols, and the agreement terms. There's also, he paused, a secondary set of documents that were not transmitted to the investigators. Records I retained as insurance. Against whom? Cassian said. Against my federal handlers, Solus said. I'm not naive. Cooperation agreements are worth exactly what the other party needs them to be worth. I kept documentation of certain irregularities in how the task force has been conducting its investigation. Things that would be uncomfortable for several people above the case agents if they became public. Elowen looked at the USB drive. Then she looked at Cassian. Mutual assured destruction, she said. It's kept me alive this long, Solus said. Picked up the drive. What happened in the next 4 hours was the most intensive document work Elowen had done in her life, and she had spent 4 years doing intensive document work. But this was different in every dimension that mattered the stakes. The timeline. Fact that the files on the drive contained evidence sufficient to either save or destroy multiple people, depending entirely on how they were organized, authenticated, and She worked at the main desk in the command center with Cassian's retained attorney, a woman named Reyes who had driven from Chicago in under an hour and who asked almost no questions and processed information with the rapid competence of someone accustomed to managing urgent situations involving documents that could not be mishandled. Cassian moved between the command center and the rest of the house, managing the containment of Solus and Devereaux, the notification of key organizational relationships, and the half-dozen operational crises that cascaded from the morning's events like aftershocks. At 2 in the afternoon, the first real problem arrived. One of the security personnel came in fast and said 3 words to Cassian. Vale is gone. Elowen looked up. Gone how? Cassian said. Left the city. His apartment has been cleared. His car is at O'Hare. He ran, Elowen said. He had a contingency, Cassian said. He had a contingency because Solus built him one, she said. In case Solus triggered his exit and needed to ensure Vale wasn't available to be questioned. She looked at Reyes. Does it matter? For what we're building, does Vale's absence create a gap? Reyes was already reviewing the document stack. The authentication from Devereaux covers the core communication logs. Vale's participation is documented in those logs regardless of whether he's present to authenticate. His absence is a problem for any future criminal proceeding against him. For our current purposes, she turned a page. It's manageable. Then we manage it, Elowen said, and turned back to the screen. At 3:45, Cassian's phone rang. She heard his side of the conversation from across the room, clipped, controlled, the particular economy of a man who had been trained by years of dangerous situations to communicate efficiently when efficiency mattered. He hung up and came to the desk. Federal Task Force, he said quietly. They've been monitoring Solas's communication channel. They know he didn't send the trigger phrase. They're sending someone to make contact. How long? Estimate 90 minutes, maybe less. Elowen looked at the document stack, at what was complete and what wasn't. What's your attorney's read, she said. Reyes. If federal agents walk through the door in 90 minutes, what do we have that's usable? Reyes looked up from the documents. The authentication statement is solid. The USB drive content needs another 40 minutes of organization before I can present it coherently. The fabrication analysis. She looked at Elowen. How close are you? 20 minutes if nothing interrupts me. Then you have 20 minutes, Cassian said. He moved toward the door. Nobody gets in this wing until she's done. He went out. Elowen worked. The fabrication analysis was the linchpin, the technical demonstration that the document Solus had provided to federal investigators carried the same digital fingerprints as the documents he had used to construct the North Star structure. Same metadata manipulation patterns, same timestamp irregularities. Same character encoding anomalies in the forged signature fields. She had identified 14 distinct markers across both document sets and was building the comparative analysis into a format that Reyes could present to investigators without requiring them to take her word for any of it. She was on marker 11 when she heard the sound from the hallway. Not voices, not footsteps. A single sharp impact, the sound of something solid meeting something solid, followed by a brief silence that had a different quality from other silences. Then Cassian's voice, through the door, saying something she couldn't make out. Then another voice, unfamiliar, raised. She kept working. Marker 12. Marker 13. The door opened. Two men she had never seen came into the room. Dark clothing. No visible identification, but the bearing and the specific way they scanned the room as they entered communicated federal law enforcement with the unmistakable clarity of a well-formatted document communicating exactly what it was. Behind them came a third man, older, in a gray suit, with the look of someone who managed other people's difficult situations for a living. Behind him, Cassian. There was a cut on Cassian's lower lip. It was not large, but it was fresh, and the blood was still bright, and the sight of it landed in Elowen's chest, with a precision she hadn't prepared for, not fear, not pity, something closer to fury, which surprised her with its intensity, and which she set aside immediately because there was no room for it in the next 10 minutes. She saved the document. She turned around. The man in the gray suit looked at her. Ms. Voss. Yes. I'm Deputy Director Harlan Marsh, Organized Crime Task Force, North District of Illinois. He produced identification and held it toward her, which was either courtesy or performance. We're here in connection with an individual named Henrik Solas, who is a cooperating witness in an ongoing federal investigation. I know who Henrik Solas is, Elowen said. I also know what he provided to your investigation, and I know that a significant portion of what he provided was fabricated. I've spent the last 4 hours documenting that fabrication in technical detail. She gestured toward the document stack on the table. Your attorney is going to want to see this before anyone takes another step. Marsh looked at the stack. Then he looked at Reyes, who had stood up and was already producing her own identification and bar card with the efficient calm of a woman who had been in adversarial federal proceedings before and found them bracing rather than alarming. Deputy Director, Reyes said, I represent the interests of this organization in these proceedings. Before you take any further action, I need to advise you that we have evidence that your cooperating witness committed federal evidence tampering, perjury before a grand jury, and wire fraud across 3 jurisdictions, and that we are prepared to provide that evidence to the court of your choosing. I would strongly recommend that any action you were planning to take in the next 30 minutes be postponed until you have reviewed what we have. Marsh looked at her. He looked at the documents. He looked at the USB drive, which was sitting on the corner of the desk in plain view. What's on that? He said. Among other things, Elowen said, documentation of irregularities in the conduct of your investigation that your cooperating witness retained as personal insurance. She paused. He was thorough. You'll want to see it. The room was very still. Marsh looked at the 2 men he'd come in with. A look passed between them, the compressed communication of people who have worked together long enough to exchange significant information without language. We're going to need the room, Marsh said. You can have it, Elowen said. After I finished the document I was in the middle of when you came in. She turned back to the screen. 7 minutes, nobody objected. She worked marker 14. The comparison table. The summary conclusion paragraph, which she wrote in language precise enough to withstand challenge and plain enough that a non-specialist could follow it without assistance. She hit save. She stood up. She picked up the completed analysis and added it to the stack in front of Reyes and looked at Marsh. It's done, she said. Cassian was standing near the door, and she crossed the room to stand beside him, which was a choice she made without deliberating about it, and which placed her in a specific position relative to everyone else in the room that communicated something she had not formally decided to communicate, but which was, she recognized, completely accurate. Marsh sat down and started reading. The cut on Cassian's lip had stopped bleeding, but was starting to swell slightly at the corner. She looked at it once and looked away. You should put something on that, she said quietly. Later, he said, "It's going to Elowen." He said her name the way he'd said it a few times now, with a quality she still didn't have the right word for, something that sat between instruction and something considerably warmer. Later, she looked at Marsh reading. She looked at the monitors where her analysis was still displayed. 14 markers of fabrication laid out in comparative tables. The technical evidence of a man who had spent 3 years building a trap and had not accounted for the possibility that someone with 4 years of document analysis experience and no remaining loyalty to anything except accuracy would end up sitting in the one room in the world best positioned to take it apart. Marsh turned a page, he turned another. His expression did not change, but his reading pace slowed, which was the document examiner's version of a sharp intake of breath. He turned to page 11, where the grand jury testimony discrepancies were laid out, and his reading pace slowed further. He reached the USB drive documentation section and stopped reading entirely for a moment, just looked at the page, and then looked up at Reyes with the expression of a senior law enforcement official who has just understood that the case he thought he had is not the case he actually has, and that the distance between those two things is going to require significant management. "Where is Solis?" he said. "In this building," Cassian said. "He's been here all morning." "And Devereaux, also here." "I'm going to need—" Marsh stopped. He looked at the documents again. He looked at Elowen. "How long did it take you to build this?" 4 hours, she said. "The preliminary analysis that identified the fabrication signatures took 3 days. The documentation of the Palladian structure took 72 hours before that. You did this in a week." "I had good source material," she said. Marsh looked at Cassian. "Your organization has significant exposure here, regardless of what this document demonstrates. The underlying operations are a separate conversation," Reyes said, "for which we are prepared with a separate set of materials. The immediate question is whether the evidence your grand jury received was fabricated. The answer, as Ms. Voss's analysis demonstrates, is yes. That is a problem for your investigation that exists independent of any other proceeding." Marsh looked at the room. Elowen watched him calculate. He was good at it. She could see the quality of his processing, in the way his eyes moved, the slight pause before each new thing he looked at, the systematic, rather than reactive quality of his attention. Was someone who had been in complicated rooms before and knew how to find the edges of a situation before he committed to a position. "I need an hour," he said. "You have it," Reyes said. Marsh stood up. He looked at the 2 men with him and gestured toward the door, and they filed out ahead of him, and at the door he stopped and turned back. He looked at Elowen. "Ms. Voss," he said, "the North Star entity. Your name on the registration instruments." "Forged," she said. 43 documents. The forgery analysis is in the appendix of the document you're holding. Pages 41 through 57. He looked at the document in his hand. "Your name was going to be the primary liability point in a federal prosecution," he said. "You understand that." "I understand it very well," she said. "And you built the counter evidence yourself." "There wasn't anyone else available to do it," she said. Marsh looked at her for another moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone filing a mental note about a person for reasons they haven't fully articulated yet, and then he walked out and closed the door behind him. The room was quiet. Reyes immediately began reorganizing the document stack, with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood that the next phase of this was going to begin in 59 minutes and intended to be ready for it. Elowen stood where she was. The adrenaline had been running for so long that its absence was physical, a sudden heaviness in her legs, a slight trembling in her hands that she hadn't noticed during the work, because during the work there had been no available attention for it, and now there was nothing but available attention, and her hands were shaking, and she was not going to acknowledge that in front of anyone in this room. Cassian was beside her. She wasn't sure when he'd moved closer. He was just there, the way he'd been just there in the vehicle on the first night, in the dark with the city going past. Presence that she had been working very hard not to define too, precisely because precise definitions required confronting things she hadn't had time to confront. "Your hands," he said. "I know," she said, "Elowen." I said, "I know." She looked at them. She stopped looking at them. "It happens when I stop." During the work, it doesn't happen. When I stop. Then sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. You're shaking. I'm aware. She looked at the monitors. At the document stack. At the USB drive still sitting on the corner of the desk. We did it. She stopped. The document is solid. The fabrication analysis is solid. Reyes thinks it's solid. She said it was the most complete forensic document construction she had seen in a non-specialist context, Cassian said. She said it before Marsh walked in. Elowen absorbed that. Cut on your lip, she said. Marsh's men were not initially inclined toward a conversation. Did you? It's fine, Cassian. He looked at her. This close, the brown of his eyes was very specific warm, she realized, which was not the word she would have used for him in any earlier context, but was accurate now in a way she couldn't argue with. It's fine, he said, again, with a quality that was different from the first time he'd said it. Less dismissive. More she searched for the word, more deliberate. Like he was choosing to make it true by saying it. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the room behind them, Reyes was organizing documents with brisk efficiency. And somewhere in the East Wing, Henrik Solis was sitting with the accumulated weight of 3 years of calculated betrayal. 57 minutes, and in 57 Director Marsh was going to come back through that door with the federal government's response to a case that had just been fundamentally reframed by a woman who had arrived in this house 11 days ago with nothing except her own name and the skills she'd spent 4 years developing in a job her father considered beneath the family name. Cassian reached out and put his hand over hers, both of them still slightly unsteady, and held it there. Not a gesture, not a strategy, just a hand. Her shaking did not stop immediately, but it changed the character. It shifted from the trembling of someone running on empty to something that felt, in some way she couldn't yet fully articulate, more like the trembling of someone who had stopped running and was only now understanding how far they had come. 57 minutes, she said. 56, he said. She didn't pull her hand back. Outside the window of the command center, the November light had gone the color of old pewter, and the grounds of Ravenhurst were still, and somewhere on the perimeter a camera was rotating on its post with the patient mechanical rhythm of something designed to watch without tiring, and the door at the end of the hall was closed, and behind it the next hour was already in motion, already becoming the thing that would determine what came after. And Elowen Voss stood at the edge of it, with a man she had not chosen, and then had chosen, and looked at what they had built in 11 days out of betrayal, and forged documents, and cold coffee, and a dog that slept under her desk. A sound like green wood splitting, and understood that whatever Marsh walked back in with, they had already changed the shape of the room he would be walking into. The question now was whether the shape they had built would hold. Marsh came back in 54 minutes, not 56. Came alone this time, without the 2 men, which was information. He was carrying the document stack Reyes had assembled, and he had the USB drive in his left hand, and he set both on the table with a deliberateness that communicated he had spent the last 54 minutes doing something. More than reading, he had been making phone calls, receiving instructions, recalibrating. He sat down. Reyes sat across from him. Cassian stood to the side, and Elowen stood beside Cassian, and the room had the specific quality of a space in which something is about to be decided that cannot be undecided. Marsh looked at the documents. Then he looked at Elowen. The fabrication analysis, he said. The 14 markers. You're confident in the methodology. I'm confident in the methodology because the methodology is established forensic document analysis applied to digital files, she said. I'm not a credentialed forensic examiner. I am someone who has spent 4 years analyzing document authenticity in a professional context. What I built is a framework. What you do with it is have your own forensic team verify every marker I identified. If they find a different result, I want to know about it. They won't find a different result. Marsh absorbed that. How did you get access to the skills you used here? The decryption, the database cross-referencing, the metadata analysis. The decryption used a pattern identification approach I developed from reading corrupted municipal records. The database work is what I do professionally. The metadata analysis is publicly documented methodology that anyone with sufficient patience can learn. She paused. I had 11 days and very strong motivation. Something in Marsh's expression shifted that same recalibration she'd seen when he'd slowed his reading pace on page 11. He was a man who assessed people the way she assessed documents, and she understood that he was currently updating his assessment of her. The North Star entity, he said. Your name on 43 instruments. My forged name, she said. The analysis is on pages 41 through 57. I read it. He looked at her steadily. The grand jury material we have from Solis positions you as the operational architect of the North Star structure. His testimony describes your involvement in specific meetings, specific decisions, specific financial authorizations, none of which occurred, she said. That's what your analysis argues. That's what my analysis demonstrates. There's a difference. She held his gaze. Solis constructed testimony around forged documentation. The testimony describes activities that the forged documents appear to support. When the documents are demonstrated to be forged, the testimony describes activities that have no evidentiary foundation. Credible witness with fabricated evidence is not a credible witness. Federal courts have sustained prosecutions on cooperating witness testimony with less documentary support than Solis provided. Federal courts have also had those prosecutions overturned when the documentary support was subsequently shown to be fabricated, Reyes said. We can spend time on historical precedent, if that's useful, Deputy Director, or we can discuss what the current evidentiary picture actually looks like. Marsh looked at Reyes. Then he looked back at Elowen. If I had come here 3 hours earlier, he said, before you'd built this, he gestured at the documents. Solis's material would have been the foundation of a substantial federal prosecution. Multiple defendants, significant charges. Yes, Elowen said. You understand that what you've done this morning has complicated a 2-year federal investigation. I understand that what I've done this morning has demonstrated that a 2-year federal investigation was substantially built on fabricated evidence provided by a cooperating witness who was simultaneously committing the crimes he was reporting, she said. I understand that this is complicated for your office. I also understand that prosecuting people on fabricated evidence is considerably more complicated in the long term. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cassian. Your organization's underlying operations, he said. The legitimate side and the other side. This document doesn't clean that up. No, Cassian said. It doesn't. We're going to have a different conversation about that. Not today, but there will be a conversation. I'm aware, Cassian said. And Solis. Devereaux. Whatever you've been planning to do with them in-house, that stops now. They're federal witnesses, regardless of their cooperation status. I need them available. Cassian said nothing, which was its own answer, and Marsh accepted it the way experienced people accept answers that aren't technically given. Ms. Voss, Marsh said, and looked at her one final time. The grand jury material concerning you. Given what's in this room today, I'm going to recommend to the supervising attorney that those instruments be set aside pending forensic review. That is not a guarantee of outcome. It is a recommendation that the evidence be re-examined before any action is taken. How long, she said. 60 days. Maybe less if our forensic team moves quickly. And in the meantime, you are not the subject of any active enforcement action. He paused. Don't leave the country. I have no plans to leave the country, she said. Marsh stood up. He picked up the USB drive. He looked at the documents on the table with the expression of a man calculating how much additional paperwork the next 6 months of his professional life contained, and then he picked those up too. Reyes, he said, I'll need copies of everything transmitted to the secure federal address in your client agreement within 24 hours. You'll have them in 12, Reyes said. He nodded once. He walked to the door. He stopped. Ms. Voss. He didn't turn around. The work you did here. The analysis, the timeline, the decryption, a pause. Good work. He walked out. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Reyes immediately began compiling the transmission package with the focused efficiency of a woman who had 12 hours and intended to use 11 of them productively. And Elowen stood in the middle of the room and felt the specific weight of 54 minutes of sustained confrontation settle into her body all at once. Cassian put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, then removed it. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said, "but it's different." She looked at the monitors, still displaying her analysis, and thought about what Marsh had said: 60 days, forensic review, no active enforcement action, and understood that what she had built in this room over 11 days was not a resolution. It was a foundation. What got built on the foundation and whether it held was a different question for a different timeline. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yes," he said, "actual sleep. Not 3 hours in a chair. The East Room is still yours." She looked at him. "Is it?" He held her gaze. Something in his face had changed since the morning, or perhaps since the ballroom, or perhaps she was only now seeing it clearly. The particular quality of a man who has spent 11 days watching someone he had initially calculated in one way and had been required repeatedly to recalculate in all the others. "For as long as you want it," he said. She nodded once and walked to the door. She was in the hallway when she heard him say her name. She turned. He was standing in the command center with the monitors behind him and the documents stack on the table and the coffee that had been cold for hours and all the accumulated evidence of 11 days of work surrounding him. And he looked like a man who had something to say that he had not rehearsed. "Thank you," he said, simply. 2 words with no performance in them. She held his gaze for a moment. "Get something on your lip," she said, and walked upstairs. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, the November light was already the pale gray of early afternoon, and Brutus was lying across the threshold of the East Room with his head on his paws. And for a moment she lay still and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel the full extent of what her body had been carrying. All the adrenaline and the sleeplessness and the sustained concentrated terror of building something fast enough to matter under a deadline she couldn't control. Then she got up. She showered. She put on clothes that Mrs. Hale had left outside the room at some point: jeans, a dark sweater. Practical choices, made by a practical woman who had been managing difficult situations in this house for long enough to anticipate what a person in this particular situation would need. Elowen put them on and did not think about what it meant that someone had anticipated her needs, because thinking about it would require her to sit down, and she was not ready to sit down yet. She went downstairs. The house was quieter than it had been for the past 11 days. Solace was gone. Federal transport had come in the early morning hours, according to Mrs. Hale, who told her this over coffee in the kitchen without being asked, with the matter-of-fact quality of a woman delivering information she knew was needed. Devereaux had gone with them. 2 of Cassian's senior staff had been suspended pending organizational review. The rest had been informed that the situation was contained and that normal operations would resume on a modified basis pending the federal timeline. It had the particular aftermath quality of a place where something large and consuming had just passed through and left the air, different. Cassian was in the East Wing office, the one she had occupied for 11 days, but he was not at her desk. He was at the window, standing with his coffee, looking out at the grounds. The cut on his lip had been treated. She could see the small adhesive strip at the corner of his mouth from across the room. His shoulders were different than they'd been for the past week. Not relaxed, exactly Cassian Rourke at rest, still carried the particular held quality of a man who existed in a world that required readiness, but something in the acute edge of it had changed. He heard her come in and turned. "You slept," he said. 14 hours. Good. She crossed to her desk. She kept thinking of it as her desk, which was a thing she would process later, and sat down and looked at the monitors, which were off for the first time in 11 days. The blank screens had a specific quality of silence she found unexpectedly disorienting, like walking into a room where a sound has just stopped. "Race transmitted the package," he said. 12 hours, as promised. The forensic team at the task force acknowledged receipt at 6 this morning. Good. She also filed a motion with the Northern District to formally set aside the grand jury instruments, naming you as a subject. Not a guarantee, but it's in the system. I know. Marsh said 60 days. She thinks 35. Maybe 40. The fabrication markers are clean enough that their own team is going to confirm them quickly. When they do, the case against you doesn't just weaken. It inverts. The instruments become evidence of the crime committed against you, rather than evidence of the crime committed by you. Elowen looked at the blank monitors. Garrick, she said. Cassian moved away from the window and sat in the chair across from the desk. He had not sat across from her at this desk. Before he had always been at the desk beside her, or standing, or at the table. The position communicated something about the current configuration of the room that she noted without naming. Your father's exposure is significant, he said. The North Star Instruments carry his fingerprints regardless of Solis's fabrication. He participated in the construction of the structure even if he didn't design it. When the federal forensic team completes their review and the investigation pivots towards Solis and Devers as the architects, Garrick becomes a participant rather than an organizer. Still criminal exposure, but different in degree. He knew what he was building, she said. He may not have known Solis designed it, but he knew what it was for. Yes, and he put my name on it. Yes. Cassian held her gaze. What do you want to do with that? She had been thinking about this for 11 days, in the intervals between decryption runs and metadata analysis and forensic document comparison, in the thin hours, when the work had slowed enough to allow other kinds of thinking. She had been thinking about her father's face in the ballroom, the relief, the arithmetic, and about 43 forged signatures, and about what it meant to spend 47 years building a business empire and a family name, and then offer your daughter as a debt instrument at a wedding reception. She had also been thinking about what came after. Not the legal after that was Reyes's domain. The other after. The one that didn't have a filing deadline. I want him in a room, she said. Cassian nodded. Not here. Somewhere he chooses, on his terms. I'm not interested in ambush. She looked at the desk. I want him to come somewhere of his own choice and sit across from me and look at what he did without anyone else managing the room. It can be arranged. And I want to do it alone. Cassian looked at her for a moment. Elowen, I know what I'm doing, she said. He's not dangerous to me in that way. He's never been dangerous to me in that way. He's dangerous the way accountants are dangerous, through paperwork and silence and the deliberate management of what other people know. In a room with just me, with no audience and no leverage left, he's just a man who made a choice. Cassian was quiet. I need to see his face when there's nothing left to perform for, she said. He understood that. She could see that he understood it, and that he didn't entirely like it, and that he was also a person who understood the difference between protection and control. I'll make the call, he said. It took 4 days. 4 days for Elowen Voss to agree to a meeting, which told her everything about the current state of his situation. A man at the height of his power would have refused or deflected or sent lawyers. A man whose empire was actively collapsing under the weight of federal attention, whose political relationships had gone cold overnight, whose son-in-law's family had publicly distanced themselves from the Voss name, agreed within 4 days. They met at a hotel in the West Loop. Neutral ground his suggestion, which she'd accepted. A private dining room that seated 12 but contained only 2 chairs, set at opposite ends of a table, which was how she'd specified it when she'd confirmed the arrangements. She arrived first. She was sitting in her chair when Garrick came in, and for the first time in her adult life, she a small tormented it, the small concrete reversal of being the one already in the room when her father entered it. The thing it did to the geometry of the space was subtle and complete. He had aged in 4 weeks in the way that some people age in acute situations, not gradually but in a concentrated compression, as if the infrastructure of presentation that usually held a person together had partially failed. His suit was still good, his hair was still silver, but something in the way he carried himself had changed the particular quality of a man who has spent decades moving through rooms, as if the rooms belonged to him and has recently been reminded that they don't. He sat down, he looked at her. Elowen, he said. Garrick, she said. The use of his first name landed in the room with a small precision. She watched him register it. You look well, he said. I know, she said. I'm not here for pleasantries. You know why we're here. He folded his hands on the table. He had always done that in difficult meetings, the folded hands, the composed posture, the performance of a man in control of his situation. She had watched him do it her entire life. The federal situation, he said. Among other things, I want you to know that the North Star entity, my involvement, was not— Stop, she said. He stopped. I'm not a jury, she said. I'm not a federal investigator. I'm not a business partner or a journalist or anyone who needs a managed version of what happened. I am your daughter, and I am sitting across a table from you in a hotel where nobody else is in the room, and I want you to tell me without performing anything why you put my name on those documents. The folded hands did not unfold, but something behind his eyes shifted. It was Solis's framework, he said. The structure was his. I didn't design. You signed off on it, she said. You knew whose name was on the registration. You knew what the exposure was. You participated in it for 14 months. She held his gaze. Why me? Not Maribel, not a stranger, not a fake identity. Me. Garrick looked at the table. For the first time in Elowen's memory, and she had a good memory, the kind that archived things at a granular level, she watched her father not know what to do with his hands. He unfolded them. He put them flat on the table. He looked at them the way she had looked at her own shaking hands 4 days ago in the command center. Because you were the most credible, he said. The archive's background, the document work, the professional record. If investigators looked at North Star and found Maribel's name, it would have been, and Maribel has no professional context that makes sense of it. You did. He paused. You had the kind of background that made the construction plausible. She listened to that. She let it sit in the room without immediately responding to it. Because she had learned, in 11 days of document analysis and interrogation and federal confrontation, that silence was a tool. And that, the space after a statement, was where the real content sometimes lived. Use the best parts of me against me, she said. He did not answer. The work ethic, the professional record, the skills I built in a job you spent 4 years calling beneath the family name. You used all of it as the architecture for a criminal frame. And then you stood at your daughter's wedding and handed me to Cassian Rourke as collateral, and you felt relieved. She paused. I saw your face, Garrick. I know what relief looks like on you. He was looking at the table. Look at me, she said. He looked up. I want you to understand something, she said. Not as a legal matter, as a factual one. The reason you are sitting in this room today, rather than being the primary federal prosecution target in a case that would have ended with you in federal prison, is because I spent 11 days dismantling the structure you helped build. And in the process of dismantling it, I demonstrated that the documents naming me as the architect were forged. Which means I saved your exposure level from primary organizer to participant. She held his gaze. I did not do that for you. I did it because it was the truth, and I don't alter the truth for personal reasons. But the consequence of it benefits you. I want you to know that. I want you to sit with it. Garrick's jaw moved once. What do you want? He said. His voice had a quality she had not heard from him before, not defeat, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The voice of a man who has reached the end of the version of himself that worked. I want you to liquidate what's left of Voss Meridian's legitimate assets in an orderly manner that protects the employees who had nothing to do with any of this, she said. I have a list of conditions from Reyes that covers the legal specifics. You'll receive it through her office tomorrow. You will comply with all of it. And if I don't, then the portion of the forensic analysis that specifically documents your participation in the North Star construction, which is currently sitting in a secure queue and has not been transmitted to federal. Investigators gets transmitted. She looked at him evenly. I built that section separately. Marsh's team has the fabrication evidence. They don't have the participation evidence. Yet. Garrick absorbed that. You'd do that, he said. To your own father, you forged my signature 43 times and offered me as debt collateral at your other daughter's wedding, she said. We are well past the point where that question has the power you think it has. The room was quiet for a long time. There are conditions beyond the legal ones, she said. Chicago is finished for you. You go where you choose, but you don't come back to this city. You don't contact Maribel unless she initiates it, and if she initiates it, you tell her the truth about what you did. Not a managed version, the truth. Elowen, and you don't contact me, she said. Ever, under any circumstances. Not through attorneys, not through intermediaries, not on holidays, not in emergencies. You are not a presence in my life going forward. That is not anger speaking. That is a decision I have made with full information and a clear head, and it is final." Garrick looked at her. In his face, she saw the calculation running. She could always see the calculation running. It was the permanent feature of his expression, the assessment of positions and leverage, and what each move cost. She watched it run, and she watched it reach its conclusion, and she watched the conclusion settle into his features, with the particular quality of a man who has understood, finally and completely, that the calculation no longer favors him. "All right," he said. 2 words quiet. No performance left in them. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one final time, at the silver hair and the good suit and the hands flat on the table and the face of a man who had spent 47 years treating other people's value as a resource to be managed, including the value of his own daughter, and who was now sitting alone in a private dining room in the West Loop, with the consequences of that practice arranged around him like furniture. She had expected to feel something large at this moment, triumph or grief or the dramatic emotional catharsis that the situation seemed to demand. What she felt instead was something quieter, a specific quality of completion, the feeling of a document that has been examined from every angle and found to say exactly what it says, with nothing hidden and nothing outstanding. She walked to the door. Elowen. She stopped, her hand on the door. She did not turn around. Behind her, she heard her father's breathing, measured, deliberate, a man controlling his own air. "I did know your value," he said. "That's why I used it." She stood with her hand on the door for 3 seconds. "That's the saddest thing you've ever said to me," she said, and walked out. The cold air of the West Loop hit her immediately, the December version of it now, sharper than November, with the particular clarity of a city that has moved from the uncertain shoulder of autumn into the definitive fact of winter. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in, really breathed, the kind of breathing you do when you've been in a room with compressed air for a long time and finally remember what uncompressed feels like. Car was waiting at the curb, one of Cassian's drivers, who learned over the past weeks is not to open the door until she reached for the handle herself. She reached for the handle. She got in. The drive back to Ravenhurst took 47 minutes in midday traffic, and she spent them looking out the window at the city, at the buildings and the people, and the particular democratic chaos of a major American city in winter, everyone bundled and purposeful. And somewhere in the middle of their own story, none of which had anything to do with hers, and all of which existed in the same shared space, which was one of the things she had always found remarkable about cities, and had never said out loud to anyone, because there had never been anyone in her life to whom the observation seemed worth making. She was thinking about that when she realized she now knew someone to whom it was worth making. The gates of Ravenhurst opened as the car turned up the drive, and the gravel and the oaks and the stone house assembled themselves in the winter light, and Brutus was visible through the ground floor window, sitting in the entry hall in his customary position of patient surveillance. She went inside. Cassian was in the kitchen, not the command center, which was unusual. He was at the table with coffee and a document she couldn't read from the doorway, and when she came in, he looked up and read her face with the particular attention he'd developed over the past weeks for the specific language of her expressions. "How did it go?" he said. She sat down across from him. "He said he knew my value," she said. "That's why he used it." Cassian looked at her. "He meant it as I don't know what he meant it as," she said. "Maybe an explanation. Maybe an apology that didn't know how to be an apology." She looked at the table. "It just made me tired. Tired is appropriate. I don't mean physically." "I know what you mean." She looked at him. "Do you?" "Tired like something has been running for a very long time and has finally been permitted to stop," he said. "Not the same as finished, just the engine going quiet." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said, "like that." Mrs. Hale appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation with her customary efficiency, and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of Elowen, without being asked, and withdrew. Elowen wrapped both hands around the cup. "I need to tell you something," Cassian said. She looked at him. "When I said what I said in the ballroom," he said, The word. I remember the word. I've thought about it every day since. He set down his coffee. He was a man who, when he was choosing words carefully, went very still. And he was very still now. When I crossed that ballroom toward you, I had a strategy. The strategy was to remove you from Garrick's control and use your skills and use the situation to resolve a debt and demonstrate something to your father about the cost of his choices. He paused. The word was part of the strategy, a signal to him. You told me that, she said, in the car, that first night. I told you part of it. He looked at her steadily. The other part is that by the time I reached you in the time it took to cross that room, watching you stand there while 400 people did nothing, the strategy had become secondary to something else. What else? I don't know what to call it, he said. I'm not a person who I don't have a lot of practice with the language of this. He picked up his coffee. Put it down again. The small unconscious tells of a man outside his usual operational fluency. You were the only real thing in that room. Elowen was quiet. Everything else in that ballroom was performance, he said. The marriage, the money, the relationships, the power structures. All of it staged. And you were standing at the window not performing anything, not the abandoned sister, not the good daughter, not the gracious loser. Just watching, just being exactly what you were. He paused. I recognized it. Because you do the same thing, she said. Yes, you watch rooms? I watch rooms. She looked at him. At the cut healing at the corner of his lip, and the gray at his temples that had come earlier than it should have, and the hands that were very still on the table because he was applying the discipline he always applied when he was feeling something he hadn't planned to feel. The word still stood for something wrong, she said. Yes, he said, without deflecting it, regardless of what else it meant when you stood for something wrong. Yes, I need you to understand that I'm not here because of that word, she said. I'm not here because of the debt or the leverage or the sequence of events that put me in that car. I've had opportunities to leave. I've had the means. I made a choice to stay, and that choice belongs to me, and it's not the same as the choice that was made for me in that ballroom. I know, he said. Do you actually know? Not strategically. Actually. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning I understood the full scope of what Solis had built, he said, the first thing I thought about was not the organization, not the federal exposure, not 11 years of operational history potentially burning. He held her gaze. It was whether you were still going to be in that room when I got back downstairs. She absorbed that. I was, she said. I know. I'm here now. I know that too. The kitchen was warm and quiet around them, and outside the December light was doing its thin winter thing against the windows. And somewhere upstairs, Brutus had relocated from the entry hall to whatever position he currently considered most strategically satisfactory, and the coffee was hot, and the house had the settled quality of a place that had been through something and had come out on the other side with its structure intact. What happens now? Elowen said. Reyes estimates 38 days for the forensic review, Cassian said. Assuming their findings match yours, and they will the grand jury instruments get formally set aside. Your name is clean. Legally, you're exactly where you were before the ballroom. I'm not where I was before the ballroom, she said. No, he said. None of us are the organization, she said. The conversation Marsh said was coming. It's coming. I've known for a long time that the window your father operated in was closing. Solis wasn't wrong about that. He was wrong about everything else, but not about that. There are decisions to make about what this organization looks like on the other side of that conversation. Decisions that affect the people who work in the legitimate side, she said. Yes, I want to be part of those decisions, she said. Not as collateral, not as a resource you're using. As a participant in the decisions. Cassian looked at her. The corner office, he said. Yes, it's yours, he said. She nodded once. She drank her coffee. They sat at the kitchen table in the December afternoon. Two people who had come at each other sideways through debt and betrayal and forged documents and federal investigations, and the slow revelation of what each of them actually was underneath the version they presented to rooms that required performance, and who had arrived, somehow, at this table, at this coffee, at this particular quality of quiet that wasn't the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of something having finished and something else not yet having started, in between, in the stillness. "I'm going to call Maribel," Elowen said. Cassian looked at her. "Not today, not this week, but eventually," she looked at the window. "She made her choice in that ballroom. I know what that choice was. But she was also a person who grew up in the same house I grew up in, under the same man, and made different choices about how to survive it." She paused. "I'm not ready to see her, but I'm not ready to make the silence permanent either." "That's yours to decide," Cassian said. "I know it is." She looked back at him. "I'm just telling you." He nodded. She got up and rinsed her cup and set it on the counter, and when she turned around, Brutus had appeared in the kitchen doorway with the silent, materializing quality he had of simply being in places without seeming to have traveled there. He looked at her. She looked at him. He walked to her and sat down at her feet, not pressing against her, not demanding anything, just placing himself in her proximity in the way he had been doing since the third day, when he had decided, in whatever calculation dogs run, that she was a permanent fixture of his world, and that her feet were a reasonable place to be. She put her hand on his head briefly. "He trusts very few people," Cassian said, watching. "I know," she said. "We have that in common." She walked out of the kitchen and down the hall toward the east wing, toward the corner office that was hers, and behind her she heard Cassian move, not following her, just redistributing himself in the kitchen. The small domestic sound of a man who has arrived at a particular moment in his life and is letting himself be in it without calculating what comes next. Brutus's nails clicked on the stone floor behind her. She went into the office. She turned on the monitors. They came up with the familiar blue glow of systems, initializing, and she sat in her chair, at her desk, with her 3 monitors and her secure access, and the view from the corner window of the Ravenhurst grounds in December. The bare oaks and the stone wall, and the camera rotating on its post, and she opened the next set of files. Not the Voss files. Those were finished. These were new, the organizational documentation she had requested access to the day after Marsh had left. The legitimate business records that needed the same kind of surgical attention she had applied to the North Star structure, careful separation of what was real from what had been built on top of what was real, so that the real could continue when everything else was stripped away. It was work she understood. It was work she was good at. Brutus settled under the desk with a long exhale, the deep, satisfied sound of an animal that has arrived where it intended to be. Outside, the December light was fading early, the way it did in Chicago's December, the sky going from pale gray to a darker gray, to something that wasn't quite blue, and the lights of the house came on room by room against the early dark. And through the window she could see the first tentative scatter of snow, beginning against the outdoor lights, thin and exploratory, not yet committing to being weather. She looked at the screen. She looked at the snow. She thought about standing at the window of the Alderwan Hotel 5 weeks ago, looking at Lake Michigan in the November dark, wanting 60 seconds in which nobody was directing her movements. She had more than 60 seconds now. She had whatever she chose to make of the time on the other side of a storm that had taken everything she thought she understood about her family, her safety, her own name, and had left her here, in this room, in this chair, with this work and this dog and this man, somewhere down the hall who had crossed a ballroom toward her for the wrong reasons, and in the process of those wrong reasons playing out, had become someone she trusted with the particular trust that only forms between people who have seen each other at the worst possible moments and found the thing they found there to be worth something. The document on the screen was a corporate filing from 2019. She started reading. The forgotten daughter was gone. In her place sat a woman who had dismantled a frame that was built to destroy her, returned her own name to herself, and chosen with full information, clear eyes, and no one left to answer to but herself exactly where she wanted to be. The snow came down outside. The monitors glowed, and in the house that had been a fortress and was becoming something else, something without a clean name yet, the work continued.